I'm Matt Downing, and welcome to Diving Deep EDU.
Curious conversations with all types of peeps. Encouraging innovation, we are diving deep. Certainly education is what we like to speak. Fervent with dedication, now it is time to teach. Yeah.
The Diving Deep EDU podcast aims to have thought-provoking conversations that help listeners dive deeper into educational practices with a focus on teacher retention, recruitment, burnout. Subscribe to the Diving Deep EDU podcast newsletter to get more information about this podcast and these topics. A link is in the show notes. Our guest today is Becca Merrill. Becca is a researcher and evaluator at Education Northwest. Her expertise is in the teacher labor market and both quantitative and qualitative designs. Her recent work focuses on teacher working conditions as a lever for teacher retention, informed by work experience as a middle school educator. Becca, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. I want to start the conversation off by you telling us a little bit more about the work that you're currently doing.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yes, I work at Education Northwest. We're an education nonprofit research, evaluation, and technical assistance firm. And I do a pretty wide variety of things here, which I really enjoy. Every day is a different task. Much of it is evaluation. We partner with school districts, state education agencies, and sometimes the federal government to help solve their problems. We're very much trying to be partners rather than telling other people how to do their work. We are cognizant that every organization has its own context and history and background that needs to be taken into consideration. So I do everything from leading projects with several people with mixed methods designs, as well as analyzing surveys, doing impact studies with quasi-experimental designs, and writing recommendations that come through all of that research to help these organizations solve problems and move forward with an understanding of literature and their own data.
That's exciting. Now, as you think about problems that you are helping districts or institutions solve, or problems that you're currently, helping them solve, what's a big one that's been on your mind recently?
Well, not to play perfectly into this this podcast tone, but it is retention. There several school districts and states are struggling with teacher retention and have been for decades. Yeah. I could go into some of the reasons why, but it's a topic that is perennial and we're not making much headway. And my assertion is that we're not actually addressing the issues at hand. So we know what they are. We know pretty much why people are leaving, but we're not either willing or able to change what's happening.
Why do you think? Why do you think we're hesitant to sort of deal with the issue at hand and we're sort of skirting around it?
So for generations, we have, and I'm going to just lay this out here, we've exploited women. Women have, when education first came over to the United States, it was actually a male-dominated field. And then it slowly became female dominated, but women didn't have the same options. You could be a nurse, you could be a teacher, you could be a secretary. So you didn't really have as many options. And so you could pay women very little and get some of the most bright and talented people in your community to be a teacher or a nurse or your secretary. Mm-hmm. And so as women have experienced more economic freedom and more political and social freedom, you can't exploit women in the same way. And so they're making choices not to go into a what some people might think of as like a servant career. And so we're having to reckon with the history of female oppression, and we're not willing to pay what it costs to get high quality, talented teachers that stay in the classroom. Because the second thing is working conditions in schools. Because women had been oppressed, you didn't have to have great working conditions. The school conditions were not set up for student or teacher success. They were often set up so that it would just be the easiest way to manage a school, both fiscally as well as if there was teacher turnover, and not so much for like the success of the student.
That's helpful. Thank you for breaking that down and explaining it to me and the listeners, giving us a background that sort of gets to the reason why, and that's really helpful. Becca, you were also a middle school teacher, so you're researching currently, with qualitative, quantitative methods, and you're getting into it through research and producing papers, like the one we're going to be talking about throughout this conversation. But you also have a background in the classroom. You're a middle school teacher. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, so I came into teaching through Teach for America, heard an ad on a radio show, and I was really caught up in the passion and the need for teaching and education. I hadn't really thought about it much before, but when I got into the classroom, I did love it. I loved my students. I still think about them. But as I was teaching, I was not very well supported as a teacher. I knew that I could not support a family on what I was paid, and I wanted to have a family. And I knew that if I stayed in teaching, I would be financially dependent on my partner. And I knew that I wanted economic choice to be in a relationship or not be in a relationship. Yeah. And so those were factors in me leaving the classroom. I also saw systemic issues that I knew I felt powerless to do anything about. But teaching in and of itself has such a powerful intrinsic value, and there's nothing like it except possibly parenting and having like a learning moment with your child. But my students, they made an indelible mark, and I loved teaching. I don't think I was great at it. I could have gotten better, but I wish I could have had better mentoring support. A curriculum would have been nice, and help for more supports for my students.
Yeah, episode 53, Eric Sarb, he tells a similar story to you. He came into teaching through Teach for America, but I think they were heavily recruiting him on the campus. So he thought he was going to like a free dinner, and then next thing he knows, he was signing away his years. But then he tells, we got into it more because that's what our conversation was about, but he left because of pay. He made it very clear. Everyone's unique, and your situation was a little, different than his, but you sort of brought it to that core in our, your brief synopsis of sort of why you left the teaching profession. And he also said that he loved it. So it's interesting to compare that brief snapshot into, his longer tale of his experience. Now, the main reason we connected was because of your wonderful article, Configuring a Construct Definition of Teacher Working Conditions in the United States. Now, in the show notes, I'm going to write that title for our listeners. This isn't something that you're going to be able to find on Google Scholar. So research it, and you can find it through those ways. But I highly encourage our listeners to check it out and read it. It's very reader friendly. I was reading it with a cup of coffee, and I enjoyed myself making notes on the article. Now, Becca, what motivated you to write this article around teacher working conditions?
Well, I had been doing a lot of research on teacher retention, and as I read, so many times it seemed to be something in the school environment that was linked to teacher attrition, the opposite of teacher retention. And so I started kind of trying to understand this better. What are the constellation of things in the school environment that contribute to teacher engagement and retention?
Yeah.
And I was looking for something more systematic, comprehensive, and even an inventory. And I wasn't finding it. This constellation of things that were happening in the school environment were not being studied systematically or in a more like paradigmatic way. And so, and because of that, they were being measured all different kinds of ways and talked about in different ways. And since the research wasn't very cohesive, it's going to be difficult for policymakers to make anything out of it, to make improvements, for unions to use the research very well to advocate for teachers on their behalf for better working conditions. And so I just saw this missing link. And I thought, well, where we can start at least is see where in the literature, how researchers are looking at working conditions. How are they measuring them? How are they defining them? So that we can begin to more systematically study them. I mean, how are they even measuring them? So that was the impetus for writing the article. It was a bit of a non-traditional article to be studying how researchers study something. So it's a bit of a sell to my committee to be able to write this, because it began as part of my dissertation, but the work then was extended past my dissertation.
Yeah, well, I'm glad they agreed because you come up with many great insights in this article. And I'm glad that they agreed. I'm glad that you published this in the journal. One of the goals of your article was to come up with an agreed upon definition of teacher working conditions. So it's kind of a twofold question. Why is that important? And what is a solid definition of teacher working conditions?
So it's important to have a common language so that when I say we need to improve teacher working conditions. When I was reading, I think it ended up being like 88 different articles in the review. Some people only considered like physical working conditions, like the building condition or how many amenities someone had. Some researchers only used teacher retention as a proxy for working conditions. So it's studied in so many different ways that when you say we need to improve working conditions, we need to know what we're talking about. We need to be able to define that because it's an unwieldy set of things as it is. Having a common language to speak across researchers and policymakers and union representatives is important for being able to create successful conditions. If we can't even define it, how can we ever make them even move forward with making something successful?
Yeah, it's true. And what is a good definition of teacher working conditions?
So it's the elements in a teacher's school environment that affect teaching. So there are a couple of important parts of that. And so one is that it is confined to the school environment. It's not something outside of the school environment, of course. And then the second thing is that it needs to affect or impact teaching. So if it's something that is going to make you a better teacher, a worse teacher, stop you from being successful, help you be successful in teaching, those are the things that are part of your working conditions.
One piece of that I kind of struggled with. So I was debating between perceptions and reality, and we talk about that a little bit in the article throughout. Like, it's not necessarily what a teacher perceives, but it's, what are they actually experiencing? But in some ways, what a teacher perceives to be can impact their reality. So if they perceive, that all of the kids are against them, throughout the day, they're going to act in a way that's a little bit more aggressive and those sorts of things. That's just a random example. So how did you work through that in the sense of you were trying to break off the perceptions from what, someone might think to what was happening, but sometimes, there's that blur or there's that, perceptions impact. How did you work through that?
Yeah, I think there was an article by Basha and Rotman. I'm trying to remember the year. I think it was 2015. I could be citing that incorrectly, but they helped me understand. They have a theory of action that says that there are these actual external things in the school environment. Let's say, like as you said, students who are not invested, their student disengagement from schooling. That's an external thing that you are encountering in the school environment. And
Yeah,
so
that's a good
that is
example.
something that policymakers, principals, that can be addressed by the school administration or by the teacher themselves or by a committee. But how that teacher perceives that internally, that's not something that we can address in the same way. The driver of the teacher's perception is the student disengagement. It's not their dissatisfaction or satisfaction with that student engagement. And so what we want to address are the drivers, not the outcomes. The teacher's dissatisfaction is driven by student disengagement in this example. And so focusing on teacher satisfaction is kind of misleading because we forget what's causing that. We're not trying to control a teacher. We're trying to create a better and more successful learning environment and teaching environment.
Gotcha. That was really helpful, that driver language. So what's driving it, and that action example, that was really helpful. Thanks for explaining that. Tell us a little bit about, you mentioned this earlier in our conversation, but I thought your angle of research was interesting. So how did you go about researching and pulling off the research of this article? Tell us, the audience, a little bit about it, because it's a little bit different than maybe a normal or another journal article might go about the research.
Sure. If I had this idea again, I might not do it because it was so much work. I physically pulled out every measure, every description, like a narrative description of what a researcher was calling teacher working conditions and how they broke those conditions down into separate components.
You did
And
that
I also,
physically?
yes,
Like
I
you read
literally,
through and coded that physically?
I did. I still have the
Wow.
spreadsheets. They're humongous.
Yeah.
They wanted them
That's
in my
wild.
in the appendix of my dissertation, but I told them it was going to add like 140 pages, and so they said that's okay. Um, and so
You should
yeah,
publish a
I
book with
physically
just that.
I physically scraped all of this out of these
Wow.
88 articles. I contacted, if a researcher said, "Oh, I broke them down in components and then measured them in some way," but they didn't list them. I contacted those researchers and said, "Hey, do you still have these? How did you do this?" And some of them got back to me and gave me that information. So that's why some of the articles didn't have that at all, and the researchers didn't respond to me. So I could just do what I could with it. I pulled out whatever theories they had, whatever definitions they had, but it was pretty solid work of copying and pasting into a spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tracked, of course, which article, which measures. So it was articles. Some articles had like a major topic,
Yeah.
say school leadership, and then they would break that into subcomponents. Leadership communication, leadership instructional support, leadership, different things. And then for each of those subtopics, they would have specific measures, say on a survey. And I tracked all of that. And so in the end, what I was doing was coding how researchers are breaking down teacher working
Yeah.
conditions into specific components. And that's where the categories came from, was an actual physical hand coding, not just of the topics, but of the subcomponents and what measures they used
Mm-hmm.
to measure those topics and subcomponents.
That's cool. Now, if a district, right, is trying to survey, their working conditions within the district. So I'm in public education, so my
Mm-hmm.
mind is trying to like take your research and apply it to like my local context, right? Now, they're trying to figure out the working conditions within their district, right? They're not going to go and do the research that you're doing. They want to know what exactly is going on in the buildings. Like, what's a process that they should do that would accurately get the teacher working conditions within their local context?
So I have a little bit of bad news for you. Um, and
Just
that
break it.
is that one of the findings from my article is that we actually don't have good, reliable measures of teacher working conditions
Yeah.
that are actionable. Right? You can ask a set of questions and say, how do you perceive this? What are your perceptions of this? And you can get a good or a bad response, but then what comes next is what? What do you do with that? And so we have several. I look at 5 or 6 different surveys and look
Mm-hmm.
at all of their items, and the vast majority of the items are teacher perceptions.
So how would we change that from teacher perceptions to teacher drivers?
Well, we need to, one, zero in on the most impactful working conditions, which we do from qualitative research. We do have a good idea of that. We know that leadership is a huge part of it. We know that resources is a huge part of it. Basically, what in the school environment can help you or stop you from being successful? What are those big things right there? Your colleagues, those close working relationships, your immediate supervisor, which in most cases is going to be your principal, who has a huge amount of power in a school, and whether you're well resourced. Do you have a curriculum? Are you wondering what to do every day? Do you have colleagues to plan with? And so we have these big things, but we are not asking schools, we're not asking teachers if they have these things. And we're not asking them in a way that districts know what to do with it. We might say, do you feel like you're well supported by your principal? That's a pretty common question.
Right.
But if you're not well supported, like, are we asking like what support you need or what support you're lacking? And we're not asking those specific questions. We're not even asking, I don't think I've read a survey that says, do you have a a curriculum that meets the needs of your students? If you don't have a curriculum that meets the needs of your students, how are you supposed to be successful? So it's like these really keystone things that can help or hurt a teacher in their success. Because I agree with, I believe it was, Susan Moore Johnson and sorry, I think she had a co-author, and I want to bring them in, but it's pursuing a sense of success. It's an article that was written. Again, my dates are really bad, but it was written a while ago. But it's still well cited because the finding was that teachers leave when they don't feel that they are in a place where they can be successful. And so, if we can provide teachers the things that will help them be successful, then they are much more likely to stay. Principals make huge decisions that affect the lives of teachers and their ability to be successful. So we need to start measuring and create measures. We don't have them yet. It's actually my current project, which is on the back burner because I don't have room for it in my current hours at work. Is to help develop these measures. And there are some people that are working on it, but I would love to know more people that are working on it and partner with them. But we need to develop these measures that are direct. They're directly measuring what helps teachers be successful. And then we also need to, these measures in all possible ways need to be actionable. Like you said, a district that's taking this survey and their teachers are taking this survey, once they get the results, the answers to those teachers' questions should tell them what direction to go in. Just recently, I'm working with a school district right now, and they have a wider net that they're casting for retention and engagement. They're actually looking at all of their employees. And so I went outside of education literature, and our federal government is doing some pretty good work around employee engagement, and they've done some pretty good research, and they have actually found some items that are like, they call it the Employee Engagement Index. It's part of the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, FEVS, they call it. And so their research suggests that there are specific drivers, and so in their survey, they have driver items, and then they have these engagement items. And so then you can, cross-tabulate that or run a regression to see what's actually driving which outcomes. And they found some pretty good research on it. And so I'm, adapting some of those survey items for a school district. And it's that sort of research. And one of the things in their report, they say that, we found these items and we find that these items are actionable and that they drive engagement.
Yeah.
We don't have anything like that for teacher working conditions. And so, so that's like, I was like, great, I'm so happy that I went out of education literature because I never would have found this otherwise on some, the Government Accountability Office website. And then I, just followed this rabbit hole. But it's that kind of thing. And I was like, somehow the federal government knows what they're doing with engagement, at least theoretically and by the research and by some regression tables, but but and you don't see anything like that in the teacher working conditions literature. It's still based on teacher perceptions and not these more. I mean, teacher perceptions are so important. You're right, because like they are this internal idea of what's going on, but they're more the outcome. We haven't measured the drivers. We haven't measured what is going on, and we're not wording it in a way that's actionable. But if we could pinpoint the drivers, we could make it actionable.
Yeah, it's really insightful. I'm curious to sort of workshop with you right now, like taking one of the characteristics that you list that I do want to get to, hopefully in our conversation, like safety, teacher safety. So a perception question, and obviously correct me if I'm going off, because I'm not thinking about these things every day like you are, but a perception might be, do you feel safe in in your school, right? Do you feel safe in the district? Do you feel safe going to your car? Like all of these things. And the teacher might say, yes, yes, yes. So how would we reword that to be more actionable, to be more driver focused? Like if we just took that one characteristic, safety, how could we write a couple that would be, more action oriented and more driver focused?
Well, you could take it in a couple of different directions. And there's not a lot of research on this. So when I'm workshopping this, just realize I'm not basing it off of a body of research, unfortunately. Right. So what we would need to know is what makes teachers feel safe, what makes teachers feel unsafe. So the outcome is what we're measuring. Again, if we say, do you feel safe in your school? Yes or no, or if it's on a continuum, like definitely, somewhat, one of those types of things, then we're measuring the outcome. We're not measuring drivers. We're not saying, how many times has a student, yelled at you this year or something like that? Have you been verbally abused by your students? Have you ever been attacked by a student? I'm trying to think, have you had to break up a fight? Have you, so these would be the drivers that might cause a teacher. Again, I was focusing on students. I'm sure there are other things that could make them feel unsafe, like a hostile administration or something along those lines. And so,
but even that, like, how would you take a hostile administration, like, instead of saying, do you feel the administration's been hostile, and then you rate it, whatever, how would we change that and make that more actionable, more driver focused?
Yeah, again, you would want to have some research, probably both qualitative and quantitative, that's helping you pinpoint what is it about the administration that's feeling hostile to you. So whatever characteristics pop out of the literature that say, let's just say one of the characteristics of a hostile administration, again, I am just making this up. I don't know. There's not research on this. Let's just say that it is abusive language in emails or disrespectful language. And that's not so much hostile, but just disrespect. But but let's just say, a question could be, my school administration uses, like react to this statement. My school administration uses abusive language in person, or like maybe, in personal communication, right? That could be a person talking to you or in emails or something like that. And then you can ask them to agree or disagree or how often or something along those lines. So a teacher or in a school that is happening, you would hope that you would get, more answers saying, yes, this is happening to me. And then you see if there's a correlation with teacher safety, right? Are they answering high? Many teachers saying, yes, I have an administration that speaks to me abusively. And then on the other side, is that driving safety? Is that driving the teacher's feeling of safety? And then you have something actionable. Well, you need to stop abusing your teachers, school administration, right? So then you have something actionable. So on a survey, you need to survey both the drivers and the outcomes that you're looking for. You want to set up a survey that says, that is linked. You want these items to be purposeful. They are on there for a purpose. They're on there not just to get a descriptive layout of what's going on in a school, but you want to be able to pair them with drivers and with outcomes. You want this, you want teachers to feel safe. Well, what ways could make them not feel safe? You need to know what that is, and then create those items that help measure that, and then see if those, hopefully you already know what those drivers are, but and then see how they relate to your school. I hope that's helpful. That's a long explanation.
Yeah, no, this is really helpful. And this is also a really tough conversation because I don't know about our listeners, but I've been in education for many years, and I'm thinking back to all of the surveys that I've gotten, and all of the surveys based around perceptions, like where how do you feel about this on this continuum? And they're just all about that. And then they take this survey and it's never used. And I think it's because they don't know, like, they're creating it, but then they get it and it's not around action or drivers, and then they don't know what to do. And they're like, oh, I'll write a better one next time. And it's all around perceptions. So they never get past that. And it's really sad. It's sad for teacher buy-in and trust. It erodes that.
Yeah.
It's also sad for the administrators. Like, they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
They're sort of trying to get to the heart of it, but they're getting to the heart of it in the wrong way. But anyway, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but like, that's why I was asking all of those questions, because it's really interesting to me. Yeah. How important that is, to bring about effective change within an organization, especially like a complex organization like a school. Another thing that I've mentioned is you pulled out 12 categories that help construct attributes of teacher working conditions. So we came up with that. Well, you've come up with that definition, that working definition for teacher working conditions. But then also in the article, there's table 3 that has about 12. Well, not about, it has 12 working categories that help us construct teacher working conditions. So the most common category was leadership and teacher empowerment. What does that tell us?
Well, that tells us these frequencies are how often researchers included items that would correlate or come under this category in their research. Now, most of these researchers are using literature to decide how to measure working conditions. And so it could be a reflection of that, but sometimes they didn't really say why they chose the components and subcomponents that they chose. Like, they didn't say why they defined it in this way. I don't know. But it suggests that researchers think, and I'm guessing that the literature reflects, that leadership and teacher empowerment are probably one of the biggest levers that we have to affect teacher working conditions, to change them for the good or bad. And those two are together because teacher empowerment is really the flip side of school leadership power. So if you have a school leader who has kind of a tight hold on power, they're not really distributing any of their power, then teachers in that school do not feel empowered. And that's a school-wide feeling, right? That's like, do teachers have any decision-making in their school? That's a little bit different than like teacher choice within the classroom. So, but they can go hand in hand. Sometimes principals have a lot of say about what happens in teachers' classrooms. So those were the questions that were often asked around teacher empowerment, were really a reflection of how the school leader was running that school, not so much whether the teacher felt empowered. Really, it's going back to the action. The actor that could change that is the school leader.
So another interesting insight about these 12 categories was that even the most popular categories like leadership and teacher empowerment were omitted, I believe, at least 22 articles, that you pulled to do your teacher working conditions. Why is that important to consider? Like, why is that important that 22 articles didn't have one of the most popular leadership and teacher empowerment?
I think it goes back to our discussion about framing and defining. So if what often happened in those articles, not all the time, is that leadership was not considered a working condition. It was considered something else. It was considered another category off on its own. But when you consider teacher working conditions defined as the literature defined it, as the characteristics of a school environment that affect teaching, well, of course, leadership is a huge thing that can affect teaching. And so a lot of times these articles were not including it in the definition. And so if I'm a researcher or if I'm a policymaker and I read this article and it says teacher working conditions are separate from leadership, and then I'm going to just look at these working conditions, then you leave off one of the most important levers in changing the school environment for success, like for a successful place to work. So again, defining is how we define things is so important, because we may have policymakers who may take up improving teacher working conditions. And if and when that happens, we need a solid definition that a lot of people can get behind and agree on. And leadership has got to be on that list, because it's so important.
Yeah.
So these articles that are leaving it off, sometimes they just don't think it's part of that definition, but it's just not how they had it in their heads. Because most of the articles didn't actually provide a narrative definition. They didn't say, and we think teacher working conditions are this. They just said, we're studying teacher working conditions, and these are the topics that we include under that. Some of them didn't say anything about leaving off leadership or including it or something along those lines. So there's a nebulousness to what's going on, because teacher working conditions, defining an entire environment that affects teaching, that's a pretty unwieldy thing to do. And so this list says, and puts into, I guess, numeric quantities, how often researchers felt that or define teacher working conditions using these types of categories. So it brings it up, but it also shows you the variation, the wide variation in what teacher working conditions are within different researchers' minds.
Yeah, and it highlights the need for an article like yours, right, to bring it to the forefront so we can standardize it and get on a consistent definition and categories. Now, as you think about these 12 categories, was there a category that surprised you that made it to the 12, made it to the final 12, or that a category that was left off and it wasn't there? Like, man, I thought that was going to be there, or I'm surprised that arrived on the 12.
So I was dismayed to find the number of articles, and I talk about this pretty passionately in the article, as much as you can in an academic setting, about demographics. And the demographics category is student demographics. Some researchers labeled student demographics, literally a student's race or ethnicity, as a working condition. And what was not, I think that there were several things going on in these researchers' heads, but what came out was basically sounding as if they were blaming students for being in schools with poor working conditions. And then that blame, that these students happen to be, well, I say happen, and there are lots of reasons why students end up in schools with poor working conditions. And it's the same students, it's predictable who ends up there. And that somehow researchers, because it happens so much that the same types of students are ending up in schools with poor working conditions and learning conditions, that those two things got conflated. Instead of seeing them as a part, instead of seeing that this school is a hard place to teach and learn, it started being the students at this school are hard to teach and it's hard for them to learn. And so that conflation was kind of heartbreaking. And that's, to me, one of the biggest highlights of and finding of this study was the problem of conflating the external things, the things going on in the school environment, and then the people interacting in that school environment, the teachers and the students trying to teach and learn.
One thing that I was surprised that wasn't included in the 12, and I sort of expected it to be as I was reading your article, is pay, right? Teacher pay. Why didn't you include it?
Well, in Table 3, pecuniary considerations is included. So it did show up. But in the end, it ended up being one of the 3 categories that I suggested do not fit within the definition of teacher working conditions.
Yeah.
Because teacher pay is very important. I just want to state that outright. Yeah. I stopped teaching because I was not being paid enough. But the question is it a working condition? We're not saying it's not important. My assertion is that teacher pay is so important that you really should consider it separately. It should be its own consideration. But it is not a working condition because it doesn't directly affect teacher. It doesn't affect teaching. If I am paid $60,000 a year and I'm paid $40,000 a year, does that make me a better or a worse teacher? Does that help me become more successful or less successful as a teacher? My abilities haven't changed. The resources at my school haven't changed. My principal is the same. So it doesn't impact teaching. And that's why I do not consider it a teacher working condition, even though it's very important in and of its own right.
Yeah, the one example I struggle with, maybe you could answer it, is let's say you have that teacher at 60,000 and you have the teacher at 40,000. The teacher at 40,000, maybe they have to get a second job, and that second job impacts their ability to prepare, their stress level, and all of that. And so when they go into the classroom the next day, they're not as prepared as the teacher making, 75,000 or whatever, because that teacher doesn't need a second job.
Mm-hmm.
They can rest, they can prepare, they're not stressed out about paying their bills. What about that example?
Well, what's happening outside of the school environment is not a teacher working condition, right? So you're giving me something that's happening outside of the school environment that is affecting teaching. And yeah, there are things outside of the school environment that can absolutely affect teaching. What if that same teacher's partner got really sick, or their child got really sick, and that meant that they had to spend a lot more time with them at home and didn't have as much time to prepare and were overworked? That's something that's personal, and that happens, and it's really important, and it can affect teaching. Absolutely, it can affect your teaching. But it's not something that a school can really do anything about. It's not something, so it's not part of the school environment. And that's why it's not considered a working condition.
Let me throw one more at you. So let's
keep them coming.
In a different way, right? We have teacher A. They're at a school that pays 40,000, and then there's another school down the way that pays 75. That teacher could go there and make that much more. That teacher A, decides to leave the school and go to the other school to make 75,000. And now that school has turnover and those sorts of things. I don't know. It's sort of sloppy, but can you help me think through why that isn't included? I'm just sort of trying to get my head around it.
Yeah. So they're not leaving because of something in the school environment. They're leaving because they're not being paid enough.
Okay.
So,
and that's separate,
And that school that has now, if those two schools, the school that's paying 75,000 and the school that's paying 40,000, let's say that they are somehow identical schools. They have clones of the principal and the colleagues and everything else.
Yeah.
And in that case, of course, the question is pretty simple of where you want to work. Mm-hmm. But more often than not, it's not. It's far, far different. The school that can pay 75,000 probably also is much more well-resourced. Mm-hmm. They probably have a teacher workforce that is more veteran. They probably have a principal who's been there for more than 5 years. I mean, they probably have so many other things that go along with being able to pay $75,000. Now, if you reverse that and you have a school that pays $40,000 and a school that pays $75,000, and somehow the school with $40,000 has all of the resources and all the great teachers and all of the colleagues and a principal that knows what they're doing and is highly competent, I don't know. That would actually be a difficult choice for that teacher because the working conditions at the school with 40,000 are so much better than the working conditions that with the school at 75,000. And to me, when you have working conditions versus pay, that's the biggest way to reconcile how different of a what would you call it? Of a thing that they are, different considerations. When I'm considering how much I'm being paid, I'm considering the life I can have outside of my school environment. I'm considering being able to pay my bills, support my family, buy clothes, sleep in a warm place, That's what I'm considering. When I'm considering my working conditions, I'm considering the factors in my school environment that help me become or stop me from becoming a successful teacher.
Yeah, thanks for breaking that down. I would love to hear more. Sounds like you're passionate as much about teacher pay as teacher working conditions. And
Absolutely.
thanks for breaking that down. And I'd love to hear more. But our conversation, as I'm looking at the time here, it's going on. So I want to wrap up our conversation, and it's time for the final word. What would you like to say to close out this podcast?
Oh, I'm going to say what all researchers say, and we need more. We need more research on this. We need to find those drivers of teacher working conditions that predict the successful outcomes. We don't have them yet. We don't have those actionable drivers so that school districts can do a survey of teacher working conditions and come away knowing where they need to improve.
And before we end, who do you want to give a shout out to?
I asked permission to give a shout out to two, and the first person I'd like to give a shout out to is Dr. Lora Cohen-Vogel. She was my dissertation chair and advisor, and she took on a kind of non-traditional student in me, and I changed my life. So I thank her for doing that and for all of her support and encouragement. And then to Matt Kraft, who also took a chance on me and didn't know me very well, and still agreed to be on my dissertation committee and was such a great support and gave such great advice and ended up making this article a better article.
Becca, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast and all of your insight. Listeners, thank you for joining us on the Diving Deep EDU podcast. If you like this episode, subscribe, rate, review, and share it out. Until next time.
Wow, it's time to reflect. That's astounding. You've been checking out the podcast from Matthew Downing. Hope you like diving deep like a scuba diver. And the show provoked hope, that's our true desire.